Thank you, everybody, for coming here. Well, this lecture is about Gaudi, and I think that almost everybody knows his name, or maybe his buildings, and so he was Gaudi. And in the handout I have given to you, there's a more detailed biography. So I don't want to get into the chronology, but I will just give you some biographical notes to give an image of his personality and his time. He was born in 1852, so he lived the change of the century and the movement of modernism, which was at the beginning of the 20th century. And even though he was part of this movement, I think he went beyond the limits of this style, because his mind and his creativity cannot be framed in just one movement or one style. He has his own architectural vision, and we will see why I say that he goes beyond. It's a different kind of building. So he was not totally understood in his time because of precisely because of this going beyond. No? Because, you have not ever seen some of the structures and ornamentations and shapes he built that were not seen before in Spain or in Europe. So most people didn't understand why he was doing such crazy shapes and crazy. So until the end of his life, he was not acknowledged as the great architect that now we know. He was also a very religious person, and this is something we have to have in mind throughout the lecture. Even in the first period that we will see, he occupied himself more in housing buildings, so this aspect is not so clear, but in the last ones there are different churches and the famous Sagrada Familia, the basilic. So we will see how he was inspired by nature in order to help people with his soul. So it was a spiritual goal for him, architecture. Also, his sponsor was Eusebi Güell, which was a Catalan industrialist. So you will see that many of his buildings has the last name Güell on it, and this is because he sponsored him in many of his projects. And well, he died at 74, unfortunately, knocked down by a tram. So it was a very traumatic death for all the people who knew him, and so maybe we can begin talking about why this title, Gaudi and the Shapes of Nature. So as you can see in this quotation, he said that nature has always been my teacher, and the greatest book, the one we have to strive to read, is the book of nature, which is always open. Everything comes from this great book. So this is when he was young, we have translated some of books about his early life and his born in his mother town, and he was always looking at the plants and the animals and taking sketches. So he looked for inspiration in the natural surroundings where he lived since he was very young. So if you don't mind, if you allow me to read just a brief introduction, because I don't want to forget anything, and my English will get better with reading. So nature, along with spirituality, was the most important source of inspiration for Gaudi. It was always before his eyes, within his heart, among his hands. His definition of originality was going back to the origin. So he looked for ideas within the natural environment for creating his works. He believed that nature's simplicity and immediacy could resolve the architectural problems, and so he didn't trust the mathematical calculations, and preferred the empirical verifications. Well, here I can add that his father was a potter. So he had this practice and this ball without many floor plans and calculation, which most of architects need to calculate weights. And he has a volumetric vision that was able to imagine how the weights would be shared in the building, and we will see why when we saw the images. So this explains the absence of reinforced concrete and steel in his buildings, because these materials always require numerical calculations. So he didn't use concrete. His most usual materials were wood, stone, and wrought iron, as well as plaster, bricks, and glass. And well, it's important also to say that in order to give an artistic shape to all of these materials, Gaudí always closely worked with excellent artisans. So even though here I'm talking all the time about Antoni Gaudí, we have to know that all the tiling, the woodworks, the painting are also made by other artisans less known, but who worked closely with him. And this is important because his buildings include sculpture, painting, different arts, not only architecture. So it's these drawings are from a book by this German biologist and philosopher, which was Ernst Haeckel. It's called the forms of the nature. And so, moved by his love for natural shapes, Gaudí didn't stop at the observation of common plants and animals, but went forward to investigate the designs of submarine flora and fauna, as well as the amazing anatomy of the microorganisms. So he had access to this book, which is, well, Ernst Haeckel was born in 1834, so it's close to Gaudí's age, and he could have access to this kind of drawings Haeckel was doing with the first visions with microscope, and we can guess that he was also very interested in these shapes. And I like to give you this vision that he went beyond animals and plants, which is what normally architecture incorporates to the buildings, the sculptures as an ornament. He looked also in the microcosmos, or the microorganism. This was just an introduction. The overview of the lecture is divided in two parts. The first one is about his early style, which the experts call Arab style because he has a lot of influence of the Arab architecture. And I call it geometrism because, as you will see, it incorporates a lot of Euclidean shapes, with circles, rectangles, triangles, and a lot of repetitions. And here, nature is used as an ornament. So instead of being the structure in the first period, which chronologically is the first, nature is used as an ornament that dresses the house. So everything will be more clear with the images, but I want to give you an overview. And the second part, which I call biomorphism, is different because nature is not just an ornament or a dressing of the house, but it's his very structure. So he uses the natural laws to try to give the space the shape of an organism. And the curves of life is a general expression to refer to all these curves we will see in his buildings. There are many people, well, you can see that the curve is the line of living things. And then in nature is difficult to find straight lines, straight angles. So we will look for these curves in his buildings to see how they are related to to natural beings. No? And towards fractal geometry, this will be maybe more difficult to explain, but this fractal geometry has more to be with nature patterns, and it's a kind of geometry that is very much closer to the patterns of nature than the classic geometry of Euclid, which is the one that we learn at the school. So fractal geometry has to be with the wrinkled surfaces, with the wavy things. So with the shapes we really see when we go to the woods or in nature. So this is the first house Gaudí designed. It's called Casa Vicens. He always worked on commission of some rich or bourgeois people of Barcelona. When a house is not in Barcelona, I will tell you, the rest all are in Barcelona or the surrounding areas. So the first thing we can see here is like a huge chessboard of green and white tiles. And as I said about geometrism, we can see rectangles, long brick rows, clearly cut doors and windows, prismatic columns, sharp lintels and eaves. All the lines are within the abscissa and the ordinate. So this is the first style has to be with this kind. I don't know if you have seen Arabic architecture, but you can notice the influence. This is a detail of the cupola and of the entrance. But even though I will show you these geometries, I want to show also how nature, even though within this first style, tries to escape the straight lines and the geometries. How? Through ornamentalism, through colors, for example. In this case, I have a little story to tell you. Is when they began to build this house, there were some palm trees in the garden that had to be cut down because they needed the space. So they opened up the space, and when Gaudí was designing and building it, he thought that he had to pay a tribute, an homage to these palm trees. So I could see here the tree trunk of the palm tree. The greens are spread all around the house. The palm tree leaves were painted in the false ceiling, and in the wrought iron of the entrance fence also he put the palm tree leaves. So I think he wanted to keep the spirit of the palm tree there. Also, he said, he has it in his diary writing, that he saw these little flowers all over the garden, so he put also in the tiles as an ornament the same flower that there was in the garden. But you can see that at the moment nature is just like a figurative copy of, or in this dome, which is not real, it's painted. It's a trembloir, but we can say that the birds that were nesting in the palm trees and they had no nest now are flying in this imaginary sky. So El Capricho is the second, and this is in Santander, the north of Spain. So this is the only one that's not in Barcelona. There's another example of this style. You can see the rounded and straight lines of the tower. It's like a heavy building. No? It's not yet the light and curved surfaces we are used to seeing in Gaudí. But even though it has, I think it's very interesting also. Well, the roofs is inclined because Santander is a place where, well, all the north of Spain, it rains a lot. So he always tried to adapt his buildings to the climate, to the natural surroundings where he built. having in mind what will happen with the weather. The walls are cladded with sunflower ceramic tiles. The watchtower is, you have seen that it's like almost disproportionate. It's a lookout. It's a place where you can see the sea from up there. So he wanted to be very, very tall. And when I saw this tower, I thought about the flower of the agave, you know, the cacti. When he made, this plant makes a very big flower with a straight trunk. Maybe it was the inspiration for him. Or a cypress. More sculptural details. So in the chapitels, it added some bird. Or the stained glass windows with birds and insects. So it's like these humble apostles of nature in the stained glass. And then the first example of microorganism, Radiolaria, which is a protozoa in the covered ceiling. So we can see some analogies or similarities. I have talked about Haeckel, this biologist. This image belongs to this book. So in the center of the covered ceiling, in the center of the X, he added this Radiolaria, these little microorganisms that whose skeleton makes these very symmetric and strange figures. Finca Way is also in the north part of Barcelona. Here you can see the first commission by Eusebi Güell, the Catalan industrialist I was telling you about. Here he had his stables and, well, it was like a summer house for him. But we can see in this image the Arabic style I was telling you, rows of parallel bricks, overlapped tiles as in the scales of a pine cone. I don't know if you can see, but these yellowish little tiles are called mocarabes, and this is a very Arab kind of tile and of construction. So we can see triangles, hexagons, circles. We are still in the first period, but this is what happens with Gaudi, that always goes, even though he's constrained by his style, he designed this wrought iron, which is a dragon, which mythology calls Ladon, and it's the guardian of the Hesperides garden. And you can see it's a filigree of iron. It's very, in the photo maybe you cannot see, but it's very big, and when you open the door it moves, and well, it's the living letters of nature. Here, well, I want to make a little note about wrought iron. You will see that it's a very important aspect of his architecture, because I think the lines of nature I was talking about, the curves, are visible firstly in the wrought iron, because even in the first buildings he begins to make these living letters. This is the G, the letter G of Eusebi Güell. That could also be his own G, with flowers and on the top of the highest tower there's an orange tree made of this metal antimony, finishing the tower, and there are, if we had a zoom, we could see more natural elements carved in the stone. Palacio Güell, the Güell Palace, was the house in the city of his sponsor, So here, the appearance is geometric, and it is probably due to the urban construction requirements. So if we saw the rest of the street, we would see that it's very close to the other buildings. So he had this space, and he distributed the floors in that way. But I think that this building is a portico towards biomorphism because of this wrought iron. No? So I will read a little text about this portico. These parabolic doors, there are two of them, resembling two huge eyelids of the Güell Palace, are the portico through which Gaudí fully entered into the wall of biomorphism. Under its arches, the black wrought iron becomes soft and involutes itself like the leaves of a red cabbage. His art liquefies the metal, flexing it, drawing the multiple undulations of the fingerprints, winding spirals like twisted tendrils, an emblematic example of the living curve, escaping from the coordinated axis. So here, obviously, you cannot see any right angle, and it's just the opposite of the geometric patterns we have seen before. Well, I found a natural example, which can be an analogy, are the winding trails below the oak tree bark. When you take off the bark of an oak tree, maybe in other trees also happens, but there are these winding lines that maybe are the tracks of the sap, but maybe it was one of his inspiration. And this is the first outline of his future fractal geometry, because it's the wrinkled spaces. And just a note, because in fractal geometry there's a thing called the curve of Peano. Peano was one of the first theorists of fractal geometry, and he came out to this curve which continuously stretches and bends itself until it fills all the space. So it's a line that can be stretched infinitely and fills the space. Is one of the principles of fractal geometry. It's difficult for me to explain much more. I'm not an expert of fractal geometry, but I know that it can be a model for understanding his geometry. So more naturalistic examples. We have here the wavy marble, which, well, it's interesting because he can make soft something which is very hard. The lantern, where the light comes in to the building, has some resemblance to a termite mound. I want to make clear also that these are just examples of analogies I have found. I never say that that this equals to this other. It's just a possibility. You know? He transformed nature. He didn't want to just copy nature. Okay, his art is about transforming, not just copying. But if you see a detail, it can be compared with spongy surfaces, or the little cells of an anthill, maybe. These are the shapes of the chimney. So he didn't make two equal chimneys. Every one is different, and you will see a lot of examples of this kind of chimneys. I don't know why he liked to express his creativity in these crownings, but here are some ideas of what can it come from. When you see the Ipomea flower, these bells, these campanulas, when it's still twisted, it resembles the shape of this chimney. And this is another possibility, the green chimney. But it can be also a beehive maybe, or so. Everyone is, of course, free of interpreting. He was a very poetic architect. So, you want to see? These are the next one is almost at the end of the century. He was commissioned to build a cellar of this same Eusebi Güell. It's called Bodegas Güell. Here I see also a mimicry between the agave leaves and the shapes of the building. He always, apart from having in mind the weather conditions, he also looked at the shapes of the plants and trees that were around the house and tried to integrate the building within the environment. This is another view. Here, looking with more detail, you could see that the corners of the house are softened as if eroded by the wind or the water. It's like a first step towards the curves. And the parabolic arches which are these ones almond-like, are also very important because they will be a key element in his future architecture. Another detail of the chimneys. Beehives, fungi, we don't know. So this is, of course, in this sense, he's very artistic because he's not thinking about functionality, but about aesthetics, art. This is Casa Calvet, also in Barcelona, and it's maybe the last one of 19th century. This is the transition stage between the early geometrism we have seen and the future original biomorphism, the change of the century. He had the same problem as in the Güell Palace, that he was constrained by the city constructions requirements. And we can still see here the symmetries. I was talking about 5 floors with 5 windows in each floor, parallel. But as always, when I look at these buildings, I try to find how nature appears at some point, in this case, in the facade. Below the balconies, there are sculptures of flowers and fruits. So he didn't like to leave a straight line. He always had to. In this sense, it's also a little Baroque. And in the inside, we can see the twisted columns, which will be also a famous feature of his architecture, twisting the columns. And the door, it's kind of alveolar, like empty spaces. He liked to include the space, the emptiness, as part of architecture, light, space. Another microorganism, this is called coccolith. We can find it in the wrought iron of the balcony. There are also other fungi and things in other balconies, but I found this to be interesting because it's just it's a microorganism. You can only have seen it in these books of biological observations. He also designed furniture. So here we have another example of the same language or style, softness, curves instead of right angles. And the peephole, or I don't know exactly the word in English, is where you see it. It's also based on another microorganism. In this case, it's a radiolaria, which is this. I think you can say for sure that he was inspired because it's very similar, the texture of both. So, and with this image, we end the first part of the lecture. These were the buildings before the change of the century. So I have called biomorphism this new style that he dares to put in practice in the 20th century. And I have subtitled it Towards a Fractal Geometry, because as you will see, there are a lot of elements related with nature as the structure of the buildings, not only as an ornament, as we have seen until now. Well, this is the floor plan of the Sagrada Familia, maybe his most famous building. And you can see the repetitive elements, no? In fractal geometry, the shapes repeat themselves, and there are like these plies in everywhere. So allow me to read a little introduction to this part, because maybe it's the more interesting and the more known about this architect. So there, the professor Eduardo Cirlot, which is an expert about Gaudi, said, Gaudi fully entered within the wall of natural morphology, not only copying it, but transforming and integrating it into architectural element, both the structural and the ornamental. So, as I explained, he was not only copying nature, but trying to transform it. And in this relationship, nature becomes art, and art becomes nature. So it's not just a copy, no? Because Gaudi was also a visionary sculptor. He dreamed with his hands, as the Mexican poet Octavio Paz recommended us to dream. And within this dream, nature began to untie the corset of the angular geometry, the edges of the classical shapes, and made its way freeing its fluent lines, its beautiful asymmetries, its multiplicity. So the arts of painting and sculpture normally represent its model with colors or stone, but architecture creates the organism, and this is the reason why it has to follow the laws which are in accordance with nature's laws. This is a quotation of Gaudi. He thought that his buildings had to follow the same laws as nature, and this search was what led Gaudi to biomorphism. But it is important to say that his art did not only imitate or represent nature, but instead transformed it. Nature, the earth, the stones, wood that the architect used, became art, his works, and in the opposite way, art became nature by blending with her. So the aim is not to state the true natural models for his creation, but to suggest certain morphological analogies, some common features between living beings or patterns and Gaudi's designs. And this belongs more to the open kingdom of poetry, the same which animated the architect's creativity, than to the exact grids of scientific objectivity. And the curve is the signature of the living substances. Gaudi once said, the polyhedral shapes and the so-called geometric ones don't abound in nature. And the flat shapes that men design, like doors, tables, boards, get always warped with time. So even though we are capable of doing flat things with wood, time warped them. So he just began with the warped surfaces because they are more close to nature. No? So I will follow the presence of this curve in Gaudi's architecture in order to show as clearly as possible the features of his biomorphic style. This is his first building of the 20th century. It's a summer house, a vacation house for one client he had. And in the outside you don't see maybe yet the the elements I am talking about, but when you enter, you can see that all the walls are whitewashed, that there are no angles between the walls and the ceilings. I think they are like coralline. He gave a lot of importance also to the light and how the light was going to arrive to all the places in the houses or the churches he built, and so the stained glass was very important for him. Here we can see flowers or maybe stars. The capitals of the columns are kind of bulbs of flowers, and the arches are lobulated. So here this house is very contains a lot of holes and empty spaces and soft surfaces, and it gives you the feeling as being underwater or some kind of submarine environment. Well, let me make a little comment also about a concept that I think in the school has been also exposed, the biophilia. The biophilia, this kind of architecture that looks for being integrated in nature, and that people who lives in there feels comfortable and in harmony with the nature surroundings and with themselves. It has worked in hospitals and many places to help healing people, and this has to be a lot with curves, with not being in cages. So Gaudi, even maybe he was not thinking about this at that time, he made it by building these interiors without angles, very comfortable. It's also, well, you can find womb connotations or uterine connotations also. In the ceilings, we can see maybe veins of leaves or gills of fishes. It's totally white, but the photograph is difficult to. And now we arrive to the famous Park Güell. It's also in the north of Barcelona. Almost everyone that visits Barcelona goes here. So this is the paradigm of architecture integrated in the environment. He adapted the shapes to the terrain using its materials. So when he was about to build the park, he used all the rocks and earth and tried not to destroy so many things. Even the shape of the park is adapted to the slopes of the terrain instead of just emptying or clearing one space and building something new. He just adapted his lines to the shapes of the mountain. In difference, other famous parks, city parks of capitals of Europe are more geometric, and nature is like obeying geometry. Here it's the opposite. These are the famous colorful undulating benches. Well, this is the trencadís. Trencadís is these mosaics, which in fact he invented this technique because mosaics are different. That they depict some image or objectively represent something, while Gaudí just break the tiles, and there are not two tiles which are the same. He didn't make it with triangles or squares, just with pieces, and even pieces of glass or from different origins, and he just put them together in a kind of a impressionist surface. These are both the two pavilions that you find in the entrance, which I think are fairy tale, but because these roofs, wavy surfaces of the towers, that seems like maybe wavelets or a reptilian skin also. One of these was his house for many years. He built it to live while he was constructing the park. But there are very interesting details, as this crown of one of the tower, which I found to be probably an analogy to the Amanita muscaria, this mushroom. And then what I was telling you about the trencadís. Trencadís comes from the word trencar, which means to break. So it's like a broken composition, we could say. And I think it has to do with the natural shapes, in the sense that color is also the trademark of life. There's no natural life without color. So an architecture that dares to cover all his shapes with different colors and bright colors, it's an architecture that praises and pays homage to nature also. No? This also symptomatic is the choice of a salamander or a dragon, I don't know, in the entrance staircase. This is an emblematic sculpture. Well, it's like the symbol of the park, but it is also made with trencadís, with these little broken tiles, different colors. So it's the second dragon we see. And the park is a labyrinth of passages, polychromatic staircases, suspended plazas, shady grottos, and lush gardens. So the shady grottos are made with earth and stones, taken from the same terrain where he was building. And you can notice that the pillars, columns, are oblique, they are not straight, and also twisted. It's another image of the same place, of the same part of the park, which are it's cave-like, rupestre, no? We would say, the cave-like passages. And also these inclined or oblique columns is a technique he was developing by now, that we will see at the end of his career. And it's a way of sharing the weight of the construction you are made, that it's much better, much more effective than if you put the pillars just perpendicular to the ground. And he had seen it in trees and other natural beings or living beings. This, for example, resembles a palm tree. There are also columns you can walk above. This is a promenade. But again, I think he was inspired by the same plants he saw around, like the agaves and the palm trees, and so he just adapted his shapes to the environment. I don't know if you recognize this one. This is very famous also. In the center of Barcelona, Casa Batlló. This is also a housing to live. It's a house, but as you can see, it's very original. I think it's the most striking example of Gaudí's style, because the curves and the polychromy have totally removed the right angles and the geometric rationalism. And it has dreamy qualities. It's like something you could dream or even paint in impressionist paintings. You can see these gradations of colors. There's also a plant-like element in the tower, which resembles a bulb of a flower. And it's all covered with these broken tiles, trencadís, and also ceramic discs, like round pieces, that with the sun gives you the reflections of a rainbow. This is more detailed. It seems the scales of some kind of reptile on the bulb-like tower. But if you look the detail, it's just a composition of thousands of little broken tiles and discs. These tiles are polished and varnished, and it goes from, maybe in the photo it's not so easy to see, but it goes from the orange, purple, blue and green. And in this sense is close to Impressionism, painting two other views of this roof. Well, this was also a typical cross that Gaudi put in many of his buildings. It's a double cross because it has four parts, and I think it's more similar to a flower about to open than to a typical cross. But apart from these vegetal elements or plant elements, we can see also skeletal elements or bony in the shapes of the facade, the balconies, which resembles metacarps, for example, or humerus, and then in the balconies, which clearly resemble skulls. Even in the color, when you see the color, it's like the color of the bones. But of course, bones are part of nature also, so he used it in more than one building, these bony aspects. And again, the inside is without angles, without any sharp edge, just curved surfaces, spirals, wavy surfaces, whitewashed. Look at also the banister is like the vertebral column of some snake or. Again, the softness of the curves, and again the parabolic arches that I told you before. Here it's in the inside part of the house, but he begins to make a lot of attempts to use these paraboloids to give this sensation of being almost in the inside of an organism, or a place where everything is soft and light, because also this whitewash reflects the light very well. And I think it's similar to what they are trying with biophilia in this kind of buildings that they are doing now, some architects. The inside patio is totally covered with these blue tiles that goes different tones of blues, giving like oceanic transparencies. And again, the wavy wood, we can see it in the windows, very big windows which allows the light to enter from the street, which is just in front. But all the frames are also wavy, both the windows and the doors. We could say that they are alveolar also, like many holes. This also seems like microscope images. When you see through a microscope, you see this kind of eyes, and in general, this house seems always that everything is like moving or breathing. Breathing. Another very famous one is La Pedrera, Casa Milà. It was another commission, and he had a lot of problems building this one also because people didn't understand why he made such a colossal cliff in the middle of Barcelona, and people made jokes about it, saying if it was to park zeppelins or they didn't understand his style, and he was just going beyond everything. And this house has been described in different ways. For example, it has been described as a mountain built by man, or a huge architectural cliff, and also as the largest abstract sculpture of the world, because, well, you can see the height of the tree, so it's really, really big, and it occupies all of a corner, so 2 streets, and it's in the center of Barcelona. It's a stony structure as a cliff eroded by a sea. Also, can imagine a gigantic sponge with ample and deep openings, caves where human beings dwell. Is a detail from below. Also, the balconies had his wrought iron with all these curves and plant-like shapes. But there's something that people doesn't know about these houses, that Gaudi dreamed that one day it would be covered with flowers and climbing plants, and his design was to look at it colorful with green plants, but the city hall, or I don't know who, doesn't follow his advice, and this is why it's so white, but it was really meant to be full of plants. This is the entrance. Again, alveolar spaces. You see a door which has more emptiness than solid surface, and which you can see if you look through some fabrics or textures in a microscope. You would see these porous-like spongy surfaces. Seen from above, the patio is just this huge empty hall, and seen from below, you can see the blue tints again, like giving this oceanic feeling. The ceilings are painted also with submarine algae and creatures of all the colors. And this inside patio allows the building to breathe and gives light and air to it. This is an example of the moldings of the interior, more wavy designs, spiral patterns. So it's what you see in the ceiling instead of a flat surface. And this is the attic. Now they have an exhibition here of all the Gaudi's works, but the arches are very interesting because they are 270 linked arcs. So it goes around all the floor, all the attic, and it can maybe resemble a snake's skeleton. And again, the parabolic arc, instead of the round or square, it's parabolic. And when you go upstairs, you arrive to this wavy flat roof, which I didn't know how to say, because it's a flat roof, which is not flat. It's curved. It's wavy, and there are these strange creatures, which are the chimneys, some are kind of soldiers, some other are kind of living beings. But there are this, for example, it's more, it can resemble the same shape of the smoke because it's a chimney, so maybe he wanted to imitate the volutes of the smoke. And there are also like textures like the skin or body or dunes. I made these photos. Wavy shapes of the chimneys also. Again with the trencadís, in this case it's white, but it's made with the same technique of breaking tiles. So there's not, obviously there's not always an equivalent in nature. You can say this is a flower, it's just patterns, shapes, no? Curves. So we go to the next one, which is the crypt of the whale church, because this is the part below a church that had to be built above, which is not built. So he just made the crypt. And this is, I have included this one because it's like his first attempt to some kind of construction techniques that will resolve the Sagrada Familia, the big cathedral. So here he made some tests of construction structures, and you can see that this is very like primitivist. He went to the stone directly. He tried to match the colors of the walls with the colors of the trunks, the pine trees. This is another view. This is the kind of oblique columns and parabolic arcs he was studying to apply to the big cathedral he had already begun. Well, this is the floor plan of the crypt, and I think it's possible to do the analogy with a turtle shell. And there are a lot of turtles also sculptured in his work, so it would not be strange that it was his model. Another example of stained glass, which, by the way, reminds me one artist that you have here in Comfort Tiffany. But I think they are the same period, the same years or closely, and they have some analogies that. And this is the interior of the crypt, which is very striking when you enter, because this is like being in a strange cave. The columns and the pillars are made of basalt, but they are not polished. They are like you bring it from the quarry and just put it them, and they have a strength and an intensity that you can feel it. And also the ceiling, again with linked arches resembling a skeleton. This crypt is also has these skeletal qualities of bones, and also the altar is just a rock without any kind of ornament or polishing. Just he wanted to go to the pure elements in this church. And well, another detail is the baptismal font, which is a shell like that, very big, present from Eusebi Güell, his sponsor that he had brought from some island, exotic island, but it's a very big shell. And with this, we arrive to the last of his works and of the lecture. It's just La Sagrada Familia, the most known of his buildings, which he began at 1883, and well, he ended because of his death, but it's still, that it's still under construction. and nobody knows when it will be finished. he in his life he recognized that he will not be able to finish it, as many cathedrals that you need several generations to finish it. But in the middle of these towers, in his plans, there has to be another higher tower, which would be, I have in 150 meters, so like 500 feet tall, and it's a rounded one that goes straight in the middle. So I don't know if they will be able to do it, but in this church, which was called the Cathedral of the Poor people, because it was built just with the donations of the religious people that wanted to build this cathedral. So no other money has gone to this church than the one coming from the people, and it's still more or less the same. He devoted the half of his life, and he lived inside it and doesn't go, well, he just dedicated all his efforts to this building. And he went from the neo-Gothic style, which was the first one the cathedral had, to the biomorphic one that we will see. And there are two aspects of naturalism in this church. One is the ornamental, which we have told at the beginning of the lecture, and then the structural, which is the inside. In the outside, the first thing we see, which can be seen from very far, are of course the towers, which we can say that resemble huge corn's ears, for example.